Thank you very much for that welcome and for the invitation to come back to one of my favorite cities in Europe. It's delightful to be here despite the long flight from Seattle where I live. What I want to talk to you about tonight is what your food ate. Now, most of us know that what we eat is important for our health. That's not a really big mystery. A nice banana or an apple is better than a bag of potato chips. Everybody knows this, despite what we actually eat. But what about what your food ate? That's a subject I really want to delve into. It's a subject of the new book that my wife, Anne Biklé, and I wrote on the topic. But this is actually the culmination of a journey that I've been taking, looking into how soils affect human societies. I'm going to give you a brief overview of a series of books that I wrote tonight, mostly in collaboration with Anne. That first book, Dirt, is basically a history of how people degraded their land and what that did to their descendants. In other words, how we treat the land in the past has shaped the way that the land was able to treat the descendants of people. And the short story is that if you don't take care of your land, it doesn't take care of you over the long run. The Hidden Half of Nature, the second book in this series, Anne and I wrote together, that looks at why microbial life, bacteria and fungi, are so important for the health of plants in the soil, and why what goes on around the root zone of plants is really similar to what goes on in our own gut, in our inner soil of the human gut, in terms of our microbiome, the microbes that inhabit us both inside and out. Plants have similar relationships with microbes. Growing Our Evolution looks at how to apply the history from the past and the science from the Hidden Half of Nature to regenerative farming. And what we try to tackle in What Your Food Ate, the new book, is looking at why regenerative agricultural practices might matter to human health, why the way we farm, what we feed our crops, what we feed our livestock, what that means for what's in the food that we eat, and what that may mean for our health. So I'm going to give you the overview, starting with Dirt. It's the book that you might expect a geologist like myself to write about soils, looking back through history and how people have treated the land. And the short answer is, poorly in great part. I thought I was looking into a book that would research how soil erosion worked in the past. Why? Well, because I'm the kind of geologist that studies soil erosion. It was a natural extension of the kind of things I think about in my day job teaching this stuff at a university. But what I realized as I was looking into that history is I was writing a history of farming. Because farming practices are the sort of the vehicle through which humanity has affected the fertility of the land in ways that have come back to really undermine society after society around the world. And it's not just a problem that has plagued societies in the past. It's also a problem today. Just a few years ago in 2015, the UN put out a report, their Global State of the Soil Assessment, that concluded that humanity, the global us, is losing about 0.3%, a third of a percent, of our ability to feed ourselves on this planet, our ability to grow food, each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation, the erosion of the soil and the degradation of its fertility. And that 0.3% doesn't sound like a big deal in any one year. It's not enough to get a farmer or to change their practices based on that 1 year, but you play that out over 100 years, the rest of this century, the kind of timescales that geologists like me like to think about, and like to think about as really quick timescales, the rough span of a human lifespan. That 0.3% adds up to 30%. Now, we've already degraded about a third of the world's agricultural land to the point where it's severely impacted in terms of growing food. And if we're on track to degrade another third this century, it's kind of like, the lights flashing alarm system in terms of how are we going to feed ourselves in the 22nd century when we have more people and less land to do it with. It will be a real challenge if we continue on the path of degrading land and follow the example of past societies that I wrote about in Dirt. Because if you look at the story of past societies, you find that soil erosion and degradation really plagued civilizations from Bronze Age Europe to classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, societies in Asia. It's a long list. I go through them all in the book. I'm not going to bore you with that tonight. But the point is that we have a long history of degrading land in different regions of the world that archaeological work and geological work have combined to essentially document. And I tried to pull that together in the book. But in doing so, I uncovered a villain. Now, if a nonfiction book can have a villain, give me a villain in the Dirt book, and that villain is the plow. Now, we generally think that what farmers do is constructive, and it is. They feed us all. We need them. But the plow, it turns out, to have been one of the more destructive implements that mankind has ever invented, despite its ability to help feed us in the past. Why? Because it contributes to the degradation and erosion of the soil. And why is that? Well, the invention of the plow fundamentally altered the balance between how fast soils are being made and how fast they're being lost. And if we think about soil the way we think about our individual bank accounts, it actually sort of helps. We all have income, or most of us have income of some form. We all have expenses of some form. And if you think about that in terms of the soil, that income is building soil, that the expenses are losing or eroding or degrading soil. But we also tend to have savings, at least some savings. And that we can think of as the standing stock of soil in the landscape itself. And we all know, and I can vouch from personal experience, that if we spend money faster than you make it long enough, you run out of it. It's that simple. And soil is the same. And the story of societies in the past is in great part one of societies degrading their land faster than they were replenishing it, and eventually that undermined their ability to sustain their society. Now, it's not to say that soil erosion killed a lot of people in the past. It's more insidious than that. It sets the stage upon which other things act out. Resilience to climate shifts, for example, being sort of a pertinent one today. But the invention of the plow fundamentally altered that balance between soil production and erosion for a simple reason. How many native grasslands or forests have you ever been in where there's a lot of bare earth? Nature tends to clothe herself in plants. Why? It helps to build the fertility of the land. It protects the soil. It shuts down erosion. It works. But when we look at the destructive nature of the plow, we can look at this photograph from my own home state of Washington. I generally find when I travel and talk about these subjects, it's better to pick on my home state than any other place in the world. So we're picking on eastern Washington because there's this really good example of why a geologist would look at a photograph like that and go, wow, this is just a natural disaster in slow motion happening here. All those little channels you see cut into that field, and that's a winter wheat field in eastern Washington. Their normal growing cycle is winter wheat, and then they leave the land fallow, and they plow it each time they go through. And then if you get rain on it, when it's been plowed, this is what you get, all those little channels carved into it. Now, they're easy to erase. You can just plow right over them. They're an agronomic nuisance, and you just rearrange the soil, but that all represents stuff moving downhill slowly to exit the scene on its way to the ocean. And what does that add up to? I mean, this is sort of maybe an extreme example of one storm, but this slide also from eastern Washington illustrates how that can add up over time to actually be a pretty serious effect. That fence up there in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, which is probably over there since I'm looking backwards, that's the land surface when the farmer first started plowing this land. And he then planted it in wheat, that wheat fallow rotation. The rain kept falling during the fallow periods. And that bar that says 1911 across the top is where the land was at the start. And he didn't want to plow through that fence because it surrounds his water cistern. So he was trying to protect that from erosion. The cliff that developed there, down to that bar that says 1961 at the bottom when the photograph was taken, is actually a 5-foot cliff. It's a little hard to tell that from the photograph, but that's a 5-foot cliff that developed from erosion over 50 years. That's about a foot every decade. That's about an inch to a couple centimeters a year of lost soil, sustained for a century, or half a century in this case. Now, it's a pretty extreme example, but you can find cliffs along fence rows like that all across North America. There's cemeteries in the prairies in the American Midwest that stand a couple feet above the surrounding terrain because nobody wanted to plow over their great-grandparents. But this is an extreme example, and I hope you're sitting there going, Dave, isn't this an extreme example? How typical is this? Well, I like this photograph because it's the most extreme example I can find. So yes, that's extreme, but it has teaching value. Because when you see an extreme example, you kind of go, oh, wait, maybe something's here. How generalizable is it? So let's expand out to a whole region of the southeastern United States, one of the original breadbaskets of the European North American colonies. Stretching from Virginia down to Alabama, that gray noodle up there on the screen is the Piedmont country, or the hill country of the region. So it's not the flat coastal plain, it's not the rocky spine of the Appalachians, which is mostly parkland. This is the agricultural heartland of the southeastern United States. And what the colors are showing you is how much soil has been lost since the dawn of colonial agriculture. So a couple hundred years of North American agriculture has lost between 4 and 10 inches of soil across pretty much that whole region, and up to 10 inches or more in some places. Now, how big a deal is that? If you go back and you read the original settlers' accounts of the fertile land that they were so excited to be working, they always described 6 to 12 inches of rich black earth over the red subsoil. and the fertility of the land is held in the topsoil. That's what's so insidious about soil erosion. You lose the best stuff first because it's coming off the top. So if we could lose, virtually the entire topsoil off of a pretty big region of North America with just a couple hundred years of plow-based agriculture, it kind of gives you some perspective on what the Greeks could have done to their homeland with a 1,000-year run in the year of classical Greece, in the times of classical Greece, or what the Romans did to their heartland that led them to end up relying on Egypt and North Africa to feed Rome after they degraded central Italy. It starts to put in perspective that, if we keep farming in this manner, with tillage, if you give it enough time, you can essentially pull the agricultural rug right out from under a society. And that's the central thesis of the Dirt Book. And that's what got me started thinking about the importance of soil for human societies and civilizations. But there's another element to it, because so far I've only talked about the loss of the soil, the erosion of the soil, its physical removal off the landscape. And you all can probably appreciate that it's a lot harder to farm on rock than it is on healthy soil. But the color differences that are on the two soils that are up on the screen now illustrate the other problem with now conventional farming practices, and that's the loss of the organic matter from the soil. And what's organic matter? It's dead stuff. The remains of plants, the roots of plants, animals that die, anything that gets buried in the earth and stays there long enough will decay and become organic matter, and it's roughly 40% carbon. What these two soils show you are from neighboring farms in that Piedmont region, in the hill country of North Carolina that I was just showing you the erosion from. And one of these is from a tobacco plantation that's been worked conventionally for the last century and a half, and the other one is from a neighboring plot of land, literally right across the fence, that was abandoned as a farm about 100 years ago and reverted to a forest. And do you notice a difference in the color? It's pretty striking. I've never met a farmer who wanted to be farming that khaki stuff as opposed to the black stuff. Why? One is fertile and the other isn't. But they're derived from the same rocks in the same climate, literally right next to each other. The only difference is how people have treated the land for the last 100 years. That loss of organic matter turns out to be actually critically important for thinking about maintaining soil fertility, but it also relates, in the end, to thinking about what your food ate and how our food nourishes us or not, as the case may be. So bear with me, and we'll get to connecting all those dots. That difference in soils I just showed you in terms of the organic matter content, the degradation from conventional farming in North Carolina, is not unusual in North America. In fact, it's not unusual around the world. There's a paper in the journal Sustainability that came out a few years back that argued that the soil organic matter content of many soils is only about half of the level that they were when those lands were first farmed, when they were first turned from forests or prairies into farmland. That number, 50% loss of organic matter, is about the same for agriculture globally. We've basically degraded, it turns out, the batteries of our farmland, the natural batteries of our farmland, by about half, getting to where we are today. Fortunately, as we'll get to, it's reversible. But first, let me share a little bit more of a sobering analysis in terms of why I would argue that how we treat the land is critically important to how long societies can last. Because turns out you can kind of calculate it in the back of a napkin, given some simple data. So when I was writing the Dirt Book, one of the things I did is I went to the library, a thing that has become relatively difficult to get one's students to do these days. And I compiled all the data I could find on how fast the world's farmland's eroding. Because I had all this observations and anecdotes and data from the archaeological literature about what the Greeks and the Romans and the Mayans and so forth had done to their land, but there weren't people collecting data at that time. So now we have journals dedicated to publishing all kinds of things, and soil erosion is in the mix. So I went and I compiled roughly, I think it was 1,400 different studies that documented how fast farms around the world were eroding. And I came up with an average number of about 1.5 millimeters a year under conventional practices. So that would be plow-based tillage, lots of fertilizers, that kind of a thing. And that 1.5 millimeters a year means it takes about 20 years to erode an inch of soil. A couple centimeters of soil could be lost in just a couple decades. That's screamingly fast for any kind of geological process. It's really slow by most human metrics. You know, my fingernails grow faster than that. But how fast does nature make soil? Because it's the balance that matters. And it turns out that if you compile the data that people have on that, you come up with on the order of about 2% of a millimeter a year. It's really slow. And at that pace, it takes about 1,000 years to replace that inch of soil that we're losing in a couple decades. That imbalance is the problem. Because by continuing to farm in a way that disturbs the soil and causes its erosion, we're basically drawing down our societal savings bank. We're depleting the natural capital that we use to feed ourselves. And it's simply a matter of time before we would lose enough of it to have it matter to our agricultural productivity. Well, how much time? Well, I've just shared with you the data that it takes for you to calculate that for yourself. So if you take that net loss of soil of about 1 millimeter a year, and that's conservative given the numbers I was just showing you, it implies that you could lose a 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick hill slope soil in about 500 to 1,000 years. Now that may sound like a hugely long time and forever to a politician, but to a geologist that's like, oh my, that's really fast. And if you look back into the geological record, the archaeological record, the geology of the last 10,000 years, what you find is that most agricultural civilizations lasted about 1,000 years, plus or minus 50%, but I'm a geologist, so that's really precise. And I'm glad you got the joke. But there's some important exceptions that I also hope you're sitting there thinking about. You know, what about the Nile in Egypt? They've farmed that for thousands of years. The Tigris and the Euphrates in the Middle East. The big rivers of India, the Indus and the Brahmaputra. The big rivers of lowland China. These are all places where we know people have farmed for millennia. Well, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule in this case. Why? Because you'll notice the geography of all those places I just mentioned. They're big river floodplains. They're deltas. They're places where the mountains go to die. They are the places that the sediment that are eroded off of other places ends up and is deposited. So if you're tilling, if you're farming in a delta, nature fixes the damage at a pace that can be sustained. Once you get outside of big river floodplains, the clock literally starts ticking on the land's ability to support a society that's degrading its soil if we're degrading it faster than we're replacing it. Now, that concludes the depressing part of the talk. Because as I was finishing writing Dirt, Ann and I bought a house in North Seattle. And that led to some revelations in terms of restoring land. Because as I was finishing writing Dirt, I was struggling with how to write a not terribly pessimistic ending to it. You know, what's our way forward? Is soil restoration possible? Could we actually reverse the historical degradation of land that's plagued society after society and still manage to feed ourselves in the process? And so in wrestling with that and thinking about that, I actually came with inspiration from an area that most geologists don't tend to work in. And that's my own backyard. Why? Because I had the great fortune to marry a biologist, Anne Biklé, who wrote The Hidden Half of Nature with me, and she is a gardener who can whisper plants back to life. She's pretty amazing with plants. And when we bought a house in North Seattle, it came with a yard that was what I like to call an old-growth lawn. It was just a tangled mass of 6 inches of the classic North American lawn. We were like, get this out of here. Let's actually plant a real garden. And we realized we should have dug a soil pit because we had terrible, crappy soil. We had soil like that Virginia tobacco plantation, khaki sand, no organic matter in it, and Anne basically took it on herself to start adding organic matter to it to try and restore our soil and bring life back to our yard. And this is the fruit of what she did. That khaki stuff, that's what we started with, has about 1% organic matter. The black stuff, that's what we have now. It took about 10 years to get to that point, but it has almost 10% organic matter. She brought it up by about 1% a year with composting and mulching and sort of attention to feeding the soil. And that's a huge difference. Recall that globally, we've lost about half the organic matter in our cropland. Here in our yard, she'd multiplied it by a factor of 10, took it from 1% up to 10%, and did it in a decade, a time scale that to me was just instantaneous. So when we started noticing these changes in our yard, we started looking into, well, what was going on? And Anne, the biologist, was like, well, let's look into the soil food web, what's happening below ground, because she would be adding compost and mulch to our soil, and we'd go back, and she'd add it in the fall, and we'd go back in the spring, and it was gone. And, you know, nobody had come in at night with buckets and stolen our compost or tried to, walk off with it. It was disappearing down into the ground. And so we started digging holes, and we could see this nice dark layer building from the top down as soil life, as biology started to integrate that organic matter and turn it into soil organic matter and work it into the soil. And so what we learned in looking into how that process works is the workings of the soil food web. Because all that compost and mulch that we were adding at the surface was being broken down and decayed by organisms in the soil. Things that rip it up, things that shred it all the way down to the bacteria and the fungi that are kind of the last stage in the decomposition process. And then what happens to those microbes, the bacteria and the fungi in the soil that have consumed all that organic matter and built up soil organic matter? Well, when they die, their remains are full of nitrogen and phosphorus and the other elements that plants need for new life. And they get eaten by microarthropods and nematodes and protozoa, other things in the soil. And if you ever want to make a nematode scientist really mad, say that they're just little worms. They hate that. But in any case, all this turnover in the soil is basically reprocessing and recycling that organic matter into the raw elements that plants can take up to fuel new growth and new life. And it's also building organic matter. And in looking into how that whole process worked, it really uncovered a new world that, to us, not a new world to science, but Anne was trained in the biology of like salmon ecology and desert tortoises, you know, the kind of stuff that you sort of think wildlife biologists would look at. She wasn't accustomed to looking at the microbial life in the soil, and you know, my training as a geologist, I certainly never ran across it, but the more we dug into that literature, the more we realize that there's literally this world of life, an underground economy around the roots of plants that's driven by microbial life that helps to cycle that organic matter back into compounds that boost and help the growth of plants. And so what's going on is a biological bazaar in the zone called the Rhizosphere. And the Rhizosphere is Greek for the root zone around the roots of a plant. It's just the sphere around the roots of a plant. And it is a zone that is one of the most life-dense areas on the planet. We tend to think of like the Amazon and the Serengeti as places that are really biodiverse ecosystems that are just teeming with life. But if you really want to find the highest density of life forms on the planet, look around the roots of a healthy plant. Why? Because we all know that plants will take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, combine it with water they pull up through their roots to build their carbohydrate-based bodies through their monopoly on photosynthesis. But what we don't tend to appreciate, and what Anne and I certainly didn't know before we started researching all this, was that plants will actually drip out of their roots or exude out of their roots, usually about a quarter, but up to half of what they fix through photosynthesis. They'll actually sort of leak out into the soil. And what are they exuding? They're exuding things like carbohydrates, fats, proteins. What does that sound like? Food. Why are plants leaking food out into the soil? They're doing it to feed microbial life in the soil. And why would they bother to do that? Well, they wouldn't do it if they were supporting pests and pathogens. Talk about an evolutionary dead end. They're doing it because they're recruiting allies in the soil that do things that benefit the plants. So as those plant exudates are released from the tip of a root, like that big thing in the middle of the screen, and those black arrows coming out of it, those exudates only make it about 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter out into the soil before they're consumed by some living organism. And what do living organisms do with the things they consume? They metabolize them. And what's left over from that? They're metabolites, or they're waste products. And when Anne and I found research papers in the botanical world that were documenting that microbes in the soil, bacteria in particular, were consuming plant exudates and turning them into metabolites that turned out to be plant growth promoting hormones right around the roots of a plant for the plant to just take back up into the plant. You know, the lights went on, and we were like, oh, these are symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationships. The plants are feeding the microbes that help the plants grow big to capture more solar energy, to produce more exudates, to grow more microbes. It's mutually beneficial cycles. And you can actually trace those cycles all the way back to land plants colonizing the land some 450 million years ago. The oldest plant fossils we know of have fungi wrapped around their roots. The original function of roots was to hold plants up, and the fungi help deliver the nutrients. So what are those fungi doing? Anne likes to call them fetching fungi. Fungi will link up with plant roots, send their fungal hyphae off into the soil, and they'll mine things like phosphorus or zinc or copper, things that aren't in great abundance in the soil, and so there's not a lot near the plant. And so the fungi are acting as root extensions to the plants. They're getting elements the plants need for health and defense and growth. And what do they get in return? Those sugary exudates, because fungi can't photosynthesize. So there's this incredibly diverse and complex interactions of life in the soil that weren't really even known. They were a little suspected in the middle 20th century, but the advent of gene sequencing technology really enabled scientists to start getting in and going, oh, which microbes are doing what things and what's being shifted from one place to another. And these relationships have started to come into focus, but they're still mostly restricted to academic journals. So what Ann and I tried to do in the hidden half is to pull that story together and to actually highlight the parallels with what goes on in the human gut. Because if you take the functional relationships between a plant and its microbiome around its roots in terms of the nutrients that it's providing to the organism, the processing of, sort of pre-processing of food, if you will, in terms of breaking down organic matter, and the chemical signaling that alerts them to the presence of pests and pathogens and tees up the plant immune system, which is all chemically based, there's direct parallels with what goes on in the human gut and our own microbiome. But I'm not going to go very far into that tonight because we're focused on regenerative agriculture. And so when Ann and I sort of came to this realization that, oh, it's the life in the soil that's the key to building healthy, fertile soils, it helped to explain why the plow was so detrimental to soil organic matter in particular in the past. Because it disrupts the soil and disrupts soil communities. It chops up the fungal connections that allow that underground bazaar to work. And I started asking the question of, well, it's one thing to restore the soil in an urban lot in Seattle where we had access to, you know, lots of coffee shops where we could get nitrogen-rich coffee grounds to help fertilize the soil. There's lots of trees that grow to get a carbon source for wood chips to merge with the coffee and use as really good compost. But what about doing it on commercial farms around the world? Could one use the same kind of ideas and same kind of perspectives to actually think about restoring soil fertility on the world's farmlands? So that's when I started working on Growing a Revolution and traveling around the world to interview regenerative farmers, farmers who prioritize building soil health, to find out what they did. And I visited farmers, subsistence farmers in Central Africa, in Central America, large mechanized farms across North America, up into Canada. That's about as far as I got before my budget ran out and I had to stop and actually write the book. But what I found was that there was some commonalities between these farmers. Now, you wouldn't imagine that farmers in Ghana using all hand labor would have that much in common in terms of their methods and techniques with highly mechanized farmers in the Dakotas growing just a couple crops. But what I found is that the farmers who had rebuilt the fertility of their land, had rebuilt their soil organic matter, all followed principles that closely aligned with what the UN calls the principles of conservation agriculture. And that is minimal or no disturbance of the soil. So they stopped plowing. They maintained a permanent ground cover, so they were using cover crops in between their cash crops. So none of those bare fields like I showed you from eastern Washington with the wheat fallow rotation. There'd always be something planted, even if they weren't going to sell it. And they maintained diverse crop rotations. And that could either be in a sequence or in terms of like the subsistence farmers in Central Africa I visited, they were growing their diversity in the fields all at once because they were growing all their food. Now, what is it about these three principles together that seem to be sort of the prescription for helping to rebuild healthy, fertile soils? Well, it's you stop disturbing the life in the soil, you feed it with carbon, and you give them a community to play with, in effect. Imagine how dysfunctional an entire city of geologists would be, for example. We would have a wonderful knowledge of the lay of our land, and we'd starve to death. But these three principles, they essentially amount to practices that cultivate beneficial life in the soil, that cultivate soil ecology. They also happen to be about the diametric opposite of what we've been teaching in agronomy for 100 years, where we've been favoring intensive tillage, the over-application of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and specializing in one or two crops. In other words, this would entail a completely different philosophy of agriculture and how we approach thinking about the land and the soil in how we grow our food. But the practices that we would use, there's actually a lot of flexibility in them, because those are general principles. The actual practices one could use could vary depending on the technology you have, the kind of climate you're in, the kind of crops that you want to grow. How well does it work? Well, I'll show you a few examples. This is soil from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio. He's a farmer who grows mostly wheat, corn, and soybeans for the North American commodity crop markets, but he also grows a lot of cover crops. He'll grow about 12 or more different species in between each round of cash crops. He gets his diversity in through what he's not selling, although he has started to now sell cover crop seeds to other farmers because his methods work so well. That shows you the soil he started with back in 1971, the khaki stuff. By 2014, he had the black stuff. Guess which one's more fertile? His yields beat his conventional neighbors. And David's hardly using any chemical fertilizers anymore. I don't think he's using any pesticides anymore. He's basically, by restoring his soil, he's weaned himself off of chemical inputs, and he's maintained his yields. What does that do? If you can harvest as much and spend less to do it, he has a more profitable farm than he used to have. He's doing better than his neighbors. This is soil from Gabe Brown's farm in North Dakota. The one he's holding up in his right hand is the soil on his market garden plot, where again it's had these regenerative principles used for, I think he's working on 10 or 15 years now. He started off with no-till, he then added cover crops, then he got into diversity. The soil in his left hand, that's his neighbor's organic farm. Gabe's not an organic farmer. He almost hit me, I think, when I basically teased him that he was organic-ish, because he'd gotten off all inputs, but he doesn't want to get certified organic because that's just not what he does. But he's virtually organic. And there's nothing wrong with his neighbor's farm, other than they plow a lot. And so what Gabe has basically done is he's basically taken his soil and restored it to virtually the carbon content of the native prairie, but he's done it with intensive agriculture. This last slide of comparisons I'll show you is from California, my home state. It's from, the dark one is from Singing Frog's farm, Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's farm in Sebastopol. The hard as rock clod is from a neighboring winery. It's the same soil type in the same climate. The difference is how people have treated it for, in their case, I think about the last 15 years. They've turned that hard, dark crust, the hard, light, crusty stuff into that rich, crumbly, black, sort of chocolate cake kind of stuff. They're pushing 10, 12% organic matter, if I'm remembering the numbers right, on their farm. In all these cases, that color difference translates into a difference in carbon, going from very low carbon content to much higher carbon content. And which has obvious connections to the soil. If we could do that to farmland around the world, it would make a serious dent in the global carbon issue. But so what are some of the benefits of rebuilding healthy soils? Based on the interviews I've done with farmers and also papers you can now find that are starting to come out in the literature, I put higher farmer profits at the top of the list, because if there's one thing that we need to have for sustainable farms is for the farm itself to be sustainable, for the farmers to be able to stay in business. And so I'm really excited about ways that if we can improve the economic viability of the world's farms while also improving the environmental impact of them, and by reducing it and also increasing the nutritional impact of the food that are grown, it's like a win-win-win for the governments, consumers, the planet, and farmers. These regenerative farmers were able to pull off comparable yields. During their conversion process, there was sometimes a couple-year dip, but there's, once the soil is restored to fertility, the yields are comparable. And you can go into the literature and find papers that if you basically add a whole lot of nitrogen fertilizer to already really healthy fertile soil, you don't get any benefit. You're just burning money on your nitrogen. But what nitrogen does is it helps you grow a lot of food in really degraded land. To me, the obvious question is, well, why not restore the land? If we use these regenerative methods, use less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel. If you're going to no-till, you're driving tractors across the field less often, you're burning less diesel. It also it can increase the carbon content in the soil along the lines of the photos I was just showing you, but it also helps the soil hold more water. A carbon-rich soil retains more water, and a life-rich soil gets more water that falls on it sinking into the ground. You know that if it rained in here and it rained on this stage, the water would just run off at the top, right? It's not going to sink into it. If we poked a bunch of holes in it, it would sink into it. Soil's the same. If we plow it and crust it over, the water runs off. If there's lots of life and activity in it, it's those conduits that are disturbed by tillage that actually allow water to get down into the soil, and that helps to increase the climate resilience of farms by giving them a better drought resistance. And that all gets us to the point of what your food ate. The title of this talk, and the title of the new book that literally just came out a month or two ago, where the question that Ann and I wanted to address is, well, what difference do regenerative practices, or what difference could regenerative practices make to the nutritional profile of the foods that we eat? Does it actually matter to human health, whether or not we shift off of conventional agriculture in a more regenerative direction? And so that's what we were exploring in this book, and sort of as a philosophical framework for that, let's think in terms of what does conventional agriculture emphasize? Well, mostly chemistry is what is the framework through which the soil is looked at. Regenerative agriculture takes a different take on that. It emphasizes cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. So it has a more biocentric orientation in thinking about it. And the way we organized What Your Food Ate was to think about how do farming practices affect the health of the soil? How does the health of the soil then in turn affect the health of crops? How does that then in turn affect the health of livestock, and what all the foregoing means for human health? So we walked through that full circle going around. And tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen really degrades soil organic matter and can alter the communities of life in the soil. This shows you a farm in California. It's, the native soils in this area are much darker than that very light color. The synthetic nitrogen is soluble. It won't stay on the fields, year to year to year. It won't build up. It runs off to create problems in our groundwater and drinking water. But it also disturbs communities of life in the soil. Why? Because many plants and many crops have two genetic pathways for dealing with how they get some of their major elements. And if you're growing a crop in a nitrogen-poor soil, it will put a lot more energy into putting out those exudates to recruit microbial partners to go find more of what it needs to grow. But if plants are growing in nitrogen-rich environments, like over-fertilized environments where too much synthetic nitrogen has been applied, plants tend to shut down their exudates. They don't invest as much in their root system. They don't produce as many exudates, and they don't recruit as many microbial partners. That turns out to alter the communities of life that are in the soil. It changes that biological bazaar that's active in the soil. And turns out that that can influence what gets into our food, as I'll get to. And tillage, of course, also degrades soil organic matter, as I was talking about at the start. So let's look at what difference can regenerative farming practices make to soil organic matter and to soil health. To do that, Ann and I went to the scientific literature, as is our habit. What we tend to do in our books is we'll write about our own experiences and visits to farmers who are doing things we're interested in, but we also dig back into the history of how people thought about this and into the science that's in the journals to figure out what we can translate out of those unreadable kind of outlets into things that people might want to actually read and know about. We couldn't find much in terms of comparisons of how regenerative practices influences soil organic matter or soil health, so we did our own little study. Why a little study? Well, that's all the budget that we had to work with. So we took 10 paired farms across the United States at each one of those dots on the map up there, and at each set of farms we picked a regenerative farm and a neighboring conventional farm, and we sampled their soil. And what did we, by conventional farm, it was the conventional practices in use in those areas. So it tended to be lots of tillage, lots of fertilizer, lots of pesticides, conventional crop varieties. The regenerative farms were farms that had practiced that combination of no-till, cover crops, and diversity for at least 5 and no more than 10 years. We wanted them all to be in kind of a comparable bucket. And besides, we couldn't find anyone who'd been doing that combination for more than 10 years in the community we had access to. A lot of the people that we put in that regenerative bucket had been doing no-till for much longer than 10 years, but they didn't get into cover crops and diversity till later. So anyway, we have these 10 paired farms across the country. The box and whisker plots at the bottom are the comparison. The one on the left is the percent soil organic matter. The blue are the regenerative farms. The red are the conventional farms. And the way you read that is that with the blue ones, they're ranging, they range from about 3% up to pushing 12%, but the average is just under 6%. The conventional farms, the average is more around 3%. Grossly, the regenerative farms had twice as much soil organic matter, twice as much carbon in their soil. And they all started about comparable to their neighbors. And this change happened on the order of 5 to 10 years. Again, a rate that is faster than you will tend to find people arguing that you can do that. But they did it, so it's possible. In terms of the graph on the right, that's the Haney soil health test. It's a score that quantifies the health of the soil. It takes the soil organic matter content, combines it with measures of microbial activity. So it's how active are the microbes in the soil. And again, the blue stuff are the regenerative farms, the red stuff are the conventional farms, and there's a big difference, about a threefold difference. In other words, these regenerative practices seem to be able to increase the health of the soil, increase the carbon content and the health of the soil. Now, the caveats here that are important are this is a really small sample size, just 10 comparisons, and we only have a couple, we have a single aggregated samples from paired fields. To really do this as a bang-up job, you'd need a much bigger budget, a lot more farms, and a lot more samples. But what I'm happy to say is that I think there's something here, and it really deserves a lot more attention because these principles seem to work in practice. Now, what about plant health? The next piece of the puzzle. Well, if we go back to that biological bazaar, you notice that those Haney soil test scores were a lot higher on the regenerative farms. There was a lot more life in the soil. And what I wish we had, but would be a huge budget project, would be to look at what the actual communities of life, who's there. But we're still at the point in understanding soil life where we don't even know what half the species are in any sample somebody sends into a lab. We're kind of at the point, I think, where taxonomists were in like the late 18th and early 19th centuries in thinking about the global biodiversity and just like, well, what's out there? They didn't know what things did. They're still trying to classify stuff, not understand their ecological relationships. Now imagine understanding ecological relationships between organisms you can't see with your own senses and that all kind of look the same if you look at them under a microscope. Understanding microbial ecology is a real complex area. But in any case, how we treat the soil can affect that in terms of the nature of plants to their soil microbiome. And what are the kind of things that plants are putting out into the microbiome? Carbohydrates, phytochemicals, fats. I mentioned all those earlier, proteins. Those are the sort of the kinds of things that plants are exuding out into the soil to feed their microbial partners. What do their microbial partners bring back and give to the plants? Micronutrients are really a major one that fungal communities will do. Things like we've illustrated iron and zinc up there, but you could also tag selenium, copper, other things that we don't need a whole lot of in our bodies. We can live without, but that for health, for optimal health, we definitely need them. Why? Because they're involved in all kinds of enzymatic reactions. They help tee up our immune system. They're really important for thriving and not just for living. The other thing that microbial life will help stimulate plants to produce or provide to plants are what are known as phytochemicals. And what are those? Well, it's hidden right in the name. Phyto is plant, chemical is a chemical, it's a plant-made compound. And so phytochemicals are things like the linalool in lavender that gives it that smell that some people like. There's also sulforaphane, which is in the brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower, and stuff. It's a phytochemical that has demonstrated anti-cancer properties. Things like curcumin and turmeric that also has demonstrated anti-cancer properties. The phytochemicals are things that plants don't just make for the hell of it, and they don't make them for our health. I guarantee you that. Why do they make them? For their own defensive systems, for their own health. Think about the lifestyle or life history of a plant. It's not like an herbivore that if it gets chased by a predator that can run away. It's stuck in place. The only real sort of language and defenses that plants have are chemical. And plants do, it turns out, communicate with one another through a chemical language that we've only just discovered in science is very active over the last few decades. Phytochemicals are kind of the key to those kind of interactions. And so what do phytochemicals do? Well, in essence, they're a health plan for crops. They're often made in response to environmental stimuli, by certain bacteria in the soil or fungi in the soil stimulating the plant to make them, or like when an herbivore will nibble on a plant leaf, it can actually trigger that plant to produce an exudate that they release around their roots into the soil to recruit particular microbes that will make particular compounds that the plant takes back up to repel that specific pest. How's that for like really, interesting, ecologically evolved relationships? It turns out there's all those kind of relationships happening below ground, out of sight, out of mind, in what Ann and I call the hidden half of nature, that are every bit as amazing and important as like pollinators and flowers that we all know about. There's commensal relationships, there's mutually beneficial relationships above ground that we can see with our senses and so we understand. Same kind of things are happening below ground, and it turns out that modern agriculture has disrupted a lot of that and, in effect, undermined nature's health plan for crops. So when you think about what your food ate, you don't often think about plants as having a diet or the soil as having a diet, but they both do. And when we think about a crop diet, Ann and I like to think about the difference between what we call the fertilizer diet and the soil health diet. Now, the fertilizer diet is the one illustrated on the left, where you can grow high yields of crops in fairly degraded soil if you add enough NP and K, enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, although the scientific evidence for potassium actually contributing to yields is a lot shakier than most people tend to argue. But we know that if you add nitrogen to a nitrogen-poor soil, you're going to get bigger plants. That's very well established. But what's intriguing is that if the plants then don't invest in as much of a root system, they don't produce as much exudates, they're going to get fewer mineral micronutrients. They may get enough of the macronutrients they need to grow and to produce crops, but those crops may be deficient in the micronutrients that the soil life helps facilitate bring into our crops. And also they will be lacking in helpful microbial metabolites, those plant growth promoting hormones I mentioned earlier. If the microbes aren't making them, the plant's not getting them. With the soil health diet, if you're growing a plant in healthy, carbon-rich, life-filled soil, it will invest more in its root system. It'll put out more exudates to tailor a specific microbial community to its own needs. So it turns out that in adopting modern conventional agriculture with intensive disturbance through tillage and the over-application of synthetic fertilizers, we've kind of undermined nature's health plan for our crops. So I don't think it's any coincidence that the global demand for pesticides went through the roof after the global use of nitrogen fertilizers went through the roof, which all happened after we degraded our farmland enough so that the organic matter content had degraded enough that it was economically viable to use a lot of nitrogen to boost yields back up. And then we started breeding crops for performance in high nitrogen environments, which helped with yields and actually took them beyond what I think were naturally supportable, but it helped to degrade the flow of micronutrients into our crops. And the micronutrient deficiency is a major human health problem around many regions around the world, and not just in the developing part of the world. So if we go now into the third section on animal health, we can ask the question of, well, what does it matter what our livestock eats? And it turns out that if we look at ruminants, cows in particular, they're another biological bazaar. Their rumen, what they're named after, is not really a stomach. It's more like the back end of our digestive tract. It's more like it's a fermentation chamber. It's full of organisms that actually process the grass or whatever a cow eats into what nourishes the cow. And most of us think that a cow grazing out in a pasture, eating grass is the grass that powers the cow. Well, no, the grass never makes it into the cow. The grass makes it into the rumen. The microbes in the rumen convert that grass, break down the cellulose, and turn it into fatty acids that the cow actually takes in and nourishes itself on. And it turns out that the nature of what a cow eats greatly influences the nature of the fats that are in its meat and dairy. In other words, the fat of the land, whether they're eating green leafy plants, which are rich in omega-3 fats, an unsaturated fat that is involved in photosynthesis, leafy green plants and the green parts of plants tend to be rich in omega-3s because they're designed to use it in photosynthesis, whereas other parts of a plant, seeds in particular, don't tend to have omega-3s. Seeds tend to be rich in omega-6s because they serve different purposes, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But the fats of the land, what animals eat, ends up in our food. And particularly in those omega-6 and omega-3 fats, those are what are known as essential fats, which means that our body can't make them and can't really change them. There's sort of a floor. What we get in our diet is what our body has to work with. And our body can modify them into other versions of omega-3 and 6 fats, but you can't create them from scratch. So what we eat is basically our sources, and in terms of what's in our meat and dairy products, what they are eating is what gets into what we are eating. So the fat of the land becomes the fat in our food. And if you have livestock that are grazing on leafy green plants, like these obviously happy cows, they basically are getting an omega-3 rich diet. If, on the other hand, you have cows that are eating predominantly seed or seed oil derived rations in a feedlot, they're getting a predominantly omega-6 derived diet. Why? Because seeds are full of omega-6s and leafy greens are full of omega-3s. Now, what's happened to the human diet over the course of the last about 50 years or so in terms of the balance between those kinds of fats? Well, it's gone from being much closer to a balance of omega-6s and 3s. If you look at wild game, it's a rough balance of omega-6s and 3s. But if you look at conventionally feedlot-raised meat and dairy today, it's awash in omega-6s. And processed foods, highly processed foods, ultra-processed foods are very rich in omega-6s as well, for the simple reason that if you read their ingredient lists, they're often very rich in seed oils. And seed oils are rich in omega-6s and virtually devoid of omega-3s. So what difference does a cow, for example, having a diet that's either sort of free-ranging on living plants or eating a feedlot rations derived from seed sources, what does that make to the meat? This is a little bit of data from Brown's Ranch. Remember, I was showing you Gabe Brown's hand with the black soil he was holding up. He's a regenerative farmer in North Dakota. He's got amazing soil. He also has amazing cattle. He's virtually restored his native prairie using regenerative livestock grazing methods that I'm not going to go into in any detail tonight, but I will show you this bit of data from his meat. On the left shows you the total omega-3 content for their beef, which is the light blue bars, and their pork on the left-hand side. The dark blue bars in the middle is a regional, advertised as natural brand of livestock, and the red or the orange bars are from conventional feedlot beef purchased at a grocery store. And you'll notice that the omega-3 content for the regenerative beef is a lot higher than for the conventional stuff, and the same goes for the pork. It's 3 to 5 times higher in omega-3s. In terms of the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, that's the graph on the right. It shows you, again, the beef and pork, the same sources, focus on the light blue and the orange. The beef off of Brown's Ranch, the regenerative ranch, has an omega-6 to omega-3 balance that's close to 1 to 1. The feedlot stuff is more like 6 to 1. The pork has an even bigger difference. Well, why does that all matter? Why even think about omega-6s and omega-3s? And I dug into this in researching what your food ate because that question bothered us. And when you get into the medical literature, what you find is that those two types of unsaturated fat are intimately involved in the process of inflammation. Omega-6 fats turn out to be fats that help trigger inflammation, that help the onset of inflammation. And we all want our bodies to be able to trigger inflammation when we need it. If we cut ourselves in the kitchen or step on a nail or something, you want inflammation to help your body heal. But you also want it to turn off when it's done. And it turns out that inflammation is not a process that just stops itself. And it turns out that omega-3 fats are central to the process of terminating or quelling inflammation. So if we've taken our diet in the last 100 years or so and converted it from something that had a rough balance of omega-6s and 3s to one where our diet is we have about 10 to 20 times the omega-6s as omega-3s in our diet, and they share similar biochemical pathways in our bodies, if we're awash in omega-6s, our bodies aren't going to be able to find the omega-3s they need to do things like quell inflammation. And that brings us to why this all matters to our health, the connection to human health. If we look at sort of the big trends, macro trends in human health over the last 80 years or so, we've actually become pretty good at dealing with infectious diseases. Now, you might scoff at that given what's happened in the last couple of years, but that's really unusual, and I'm actually quite happy to be able to travel again. But if we look back at the last, what happened, over the 20th century, our great-grandparents, feared diseases we only know its names. Cholera and polio, to name just a few. We've become very good at trying to treat, medical science became very good at treating infectious diseases. But chronic diseases really went through the roof in the later 20th century, despite our control of infectious diseases. So there's now, and that's the graph on the right, sort of the rise of various types of chronic diseases. Now in the United States, 7 out of 10 Americans suffer from at least one chronic disease. That's getting darn near close to everybody. I mean, you can't get 70% of Americans to agree on anything. And yet 7 out of 10 of us are suffering from a chronic disease today. And many of those diseases are things that in our great-grandparents' days were just unknown, unheard of. Now, was that because they were undiagnosed or not? And, I'm not going to get into that. I don't know. But it is an interesting question where now the kinds of major health problems that we tend to have in the Western world are chronic illness problems. Oops, I advanced 2. And so one question, of course, is how much is that related to things like the changing of omega-6 and O3 ratios in our diet, how much in terms of phytochemicals and mineral micronutrients we're getting in our food. When you ask questions like that and you go to the scientific literature, generally what you find is that people who have asked the question of do farming practices influence the quality of food, they're framing things around organic versus conventional, biologic versus conventional farming practices. And what you find when you read that literature is there's a bit of a mess and a lot of people arguing back and forth about whether there's much of a difference. Anne and I found in those kind of studies that there's not a whole lot of evidence for big differences in the macronutrient profiles for the most part, but there's almost always evidence that there's differences in micronutrients and phytochemicals, with organic crops having higher levels of both. Why might that be? Well, maybe because it takes better care of the soil. But the studies that look at that don't generally tend to make that connection. They're just looking at the higher level of those 2 practices. Conventional crops, they almost always have higher levels of pesticides and heavy metals. There's a lot of controversy scientifically about how much is enough to affect human health, and the companies that make them will, of course, assure you that the levels in food are perfectly safe. But there's other scientists who are starting to look into it and thinking and arguing that, well, what about the issue of chronic exposure to even small amounts over a whole lifetime? How much does that actually influence our health? And I think there's reasons to keep asking those questions because there's some very interesting connections there. But again, that's what you tend to find in the literature today. So one of the things that Anne and I wanted to do is do a little bit of testing on crops that were grown under regenerative practices versus conventional practices, as opposed to organic versus conventional. And you had 2 basic comparisons that we looked at. The first one was an opportunistic study that we did on some wheat that was grown in northern Oregon, just south of Washington, where I live, where we looked at 2 crops of wheat grown side by side in neighboring fields that were direct seeded, so they were both no-till. But one of them used diverse cover crops to essentially control weeds and to help replenish the soil, and the other used chemical herbicides, I believe it was glyphosate if I'm recalling correctly, which can have big effects on life in the soil. And what we did is after the second year of that experiment, we tested their wheat and we looked at the minerals in the wheat. And that's what all those elements over the left are. It's the full suite of minerals. The column on the right is the ratio of how much of those minerals were found in the cover cropped versus the conventional one. So all the green ones are places where the more regeneratively farmed crops had more minerals, more of those particular minerals than the conventional, and the red ones are where the conventional had more. So let's focus first on the red numbers. Sodium, nickel, cadmium. The conventional crops all had more, or the conventional wheat had more. Do you want sodium, nickel, and cadmium in your food? I don't. I get plenty of sodium from potato chips. I don't need any more. If we look at the green numbers, though, the one I've shown in the big one, zinc, 56% more zinc in the regeneratively grown crop. These are in the neighboring fields. It's the same soil. You can't raise the zinc content of the soil that much, that fast. What you can do is change the biology, because there's generally enough zinc in the rock particles. They're just in the rock particles. The trick is getting it out of the rocks and into the crop, and that's what the life in the soil does. So the only conclusion I can offer on this experiment is either the whole thing is bogus, which I don't think it is because it's a fairly straightforward comparison, or the life in the soil changed fast enough to unlock the mineral elements from the soil particles and deliver them to the crops in those symbiotic relationships that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature. The other comparison we did of regenerative to conventional involved those 10 paired farms across the US, where we actually measured the differences in soil health. And what we found, what we asked is the farmers on each of those pairs of crops to grow the identical crop and crop variety on their neighboring farms, send it into an independent soil food testing lab that has a national reputation. And then we looked at the numbers that came back as ratios. And what we've basically found is that phytochemicals, carotenoids, things like the beta-carotene in carrots and squash, and phenolics and phytosterols, which have anti-cholesterol managing properties, those things were all about 20% higher in the regeneratively farmed crops. And a suite of vitamins, K, C, E, and B1 were also higher on average in the regenerative crops, supporting the idea that, yes, the way that we farm actually is influencing what's getting into the human food supply. Now again, these are small number comparisons on a small number of farms with a small number of crops, but is highly suggestive that the idea that the connection between soil health, crop health, animal health translates right on into what's in our food. And if we're getting more vitamins and more phytochemicals and more mineral micronutrients that are independently shown to support health, you can make the argument that these regeneratively grown foods are probably healthier for us to eat. It's hard to demonstrate that on an individual basis, but those are the kinds of connections that you can sort of pull together in looking at this kind of stuff. So in What Your Food Ate, what we're arguing is that regenerative farming can increase the carbon content of soils, it can increase soil organic matter, it can increase the phytochemicals, phenolics, phytosterols, and carotenoids in the examples that we pursued. Certain vitamins and mineral micronutrients appear to be higher in regeneratively grown crops. And for regeneratively grazed meat and dairy, the omega-3 content seems to be a lot better. And more in line with what the medical literature would argue would make for a healthy diet. So in a general cartoon sense, whether at an individual level or at a societal level, poor soil health, if we degrade the land, we get sick crops and farm animals and sick people. At the other level, we can turn it around and argue that healthy soils lead to healthier crops and farm animals, lead to healthier people. Now, as a gross generality, I think that's pretty good. We all know that a lot of other things affect our health, whether we get any exercise, what we eat, it matters. Our genes, our lifestyle. But we'd like to add to the list what your food ate, and how we raised our food, how we practice agriculture. And I think it's important not just on an individual level, but if we think about sustaining societies over the long run, where I started on this intellectual journey, it becomes even more critical, because it compels us to ask the questions of how much of an obligation do we have to future generations to enable them to be able to grow healthy foods as well and well into the future. And I like to think that we do have intergenerational responsibilities of that nature. We've learned a lot of this stuff just in the last 50 to 80 years since the dawn of modern conventional agriculture. And I think it's time to actually shift and convert conventional agriculture into a more regenerative footing. It's starting to make economic sense, it makes sense for health, it makes sense for the environment. I think it could be truly a win-win-win, because in the end, I think what we've kind of shown, and what many of you probably already suspect, is that what's good for the land is good for us too. So I'll leave you there. Obviously, I recommend our books, but I appreciate your attention, and I think we have an opportunity for some Q&A.